thank you all for being with us today. As we get this conversation started, I wanted to highlight that Eightfold and Accenture have been working closely to help many organizations and HR and talent practitioners to better understand how the use of AI can help your company thrive. And this can come in many different shapes and forms. So we thought it might be helpful to start the conversation today with a poll to hear from you. And what comes to mind when you think of AI? I believe we have some entries coming in here, and we'll start to see those appear on the screen.
I haven't seen the ones which says humanoids before, though. But
maybe it's about automating humanoids.
Give folks a second here to be able to contribute some more.
Ooh, data, my favorite topic. I think there's a lot we're going to talk about data today and how the data landscape has changed over the next few years. That's interesting to see.
Smart and learn. Future fit. Love that. Automation.
It's interesting that the first thing that comes to people's mind is automation when you talk about AI.
The bots are coming, aren't they, Ashwin?
I sure hope. There you go. You said it and it came on the screen.
Cost savings.
Cortana.
Haven't seen that in a while. I think Microsoft may have renamed it.
All right, we'll get a couple more here, but in the meantime, when we talk about, what do we talk about when we say AI and HR? I'm going to go ahead and get the conversation started. I'm going to turn it over to you first, Ashwin, to provide some responses, and would love to hear from Sachit as well as Russell.
Yeah, and AI is changing how most industries operate right now, and HR as a function is no exception. We've seen a lot of use cases. I mean, we can think of employee retention, obtaining the best training paths for people, candidate sourcing, screening, assessing, employee engagement. AI can be applicable to all of those things. But I'm going to start off with two much more basic things that I hear of the most often. I think one is, what is AI? I mean, people even in the industry use the term analytics and data science and AI and machine learning and deep learning pretty interchangeably sometimes. And I just wanted to talk for a few minutes on how I think about it personally. I think for me, data analysis typically implies what you would do when you take historical data, look at it, and put it forward in dashboards or in some level of basic automation. Then you can think of, how do you solve a business problem and how do you generate insights? How do you potentially predict what's going to happen in the future? And that's typically the world of data science, right? When you actually take data and try to answer a specific business problem. Now, when you go one level further and you want to automate that and make, let's call it an app out of it or a workflow out of it, that's when machine learning comes into its own. So machine learning as a part of AI allows you to say, here are my inputs, here are my outputs. If I give you inputs and how do I get to the right output? Right? And the last thing I keep hearing about quite often is what we call as deep learning or neural networks, which is a thing that lies between the input and the output, right? It's one of the ways of doing machine learning to say, how does a system actually give you the right output if you think about giving it certain input. I think that in my head is a little bit of how I would differentiate different parts of AI. You can think about, for each of these, you can think about examples, right? In the HR world, you would have typical dashboards around, employee attrition, right? Or once you go to the data science and predictive world, you want to know not only who's attriting or who do you want to retain, but what's the best way of retaining them and what can have the most impact on retaining people. Right? If you want to think about machine learning, I think we talk a lot about skills in today's world and how do you have a workflow that automates the fact that you can generate skills from a wide variety of different ways. Right? And last, when you think about neural networks or deep learning, I think about resume parsing or sentiment analysis of a large amount of text which you have externally. Neural networks are great, and deep learning is great for doing some of those kind of things. So I wanted to just lay that out there because you would hear all of these different terms, but Sachit, Russell, Jacob, I welcome thoughts from you as well.
Yeah,
I would, go ahead.
when I think about it, I primarily go to some of the practical applications, right? So if you just think about, going from a world in which, a recruiter has to, review resumes on a, sort of on a manual basis. When you talk about some large corporations out there that, have tens of millions of resumes in their databases, it's just practically impossible for a human being to process that level of data. And so when I think about sort of some of the practical applications out there, I love that automation came up in the survey that we just ran, because effectively that's what AI can do, right? It can translate effectively, going through all of that data in real time and then come up with results of, the 10 or 20 people you should be talking to for a particular position. That's the sort of innovation that AI can create. And, that's what we've seen in our customer base up to this point.
And I was going to pile on exactly as Sachit just did and say in practical terms, regardless of which subsets of AI we're talking about, the ability of the machine to look at much larger data sets much faster than a human being can is the real power of this. And certainly the recruiting example is a good one. Another one is and we've all dealt with natural language processing, whether it's a problem with your credit card, or if you want an HR example, when you're trying to go on an LOA or something like that, and you call up your operations center and you get a push one for this, push two for that. In simplest terms, that's where AI started in the HR space. And then it has now moved forward into recruiting. It has now moved forward into more talent strategy around retention and succession planning and workforce planning and some of the things you can do with the amounts of data that are out there. But they're all subcomponents. And wherever there is a data set and decisions to be made and the way that a human mind would go after it, what is emerging is we can also put those data sets to a machine, and it can calculate tens of thousands of calculations in the time a human can look at 2 or 3. Doesn't mean it calculates them differently. If it's trained correctly, calculates them the same way, but it can do it at a much faster pace and then inform the human who can then take that forward to the next step for whatever it is you're trying to solve.
Yeah, and Russell, what you just said actually dovetails very well into the second question I hear quite often when people talk about AI, especially in HR. How do you make sure it is ethical, responsible, whatever term you want to use? And I think one of the ways is just being conscious of the fact that some technological advancement and large amounts of data can lead teams into uncharted territory. I think one of the questions I hear quite often is how do we make sure things are de-biased, things are explainable? And one of the ways I try to explain to people is just being aware that this is a question every single time you deal with an AI application. As an example, you mentioned having a human in the loop. I think that's pretty key, right? Having a human in the loop is actually useful when you do some of these things. I'm not saying you must be in the loop all the time, but towards the end of the cycle, there has to be some level of validation.
Yeah, I think that's critical. I think that a lot of times when we engage with clients in these types of discussions, it naturally evolves to not letting the machine make the decision or the data be the sole source of input. And I try to quickly reframe the conversation that this is just another input to the dialogue and to help you make a decision as a human being versus it being the decision maker for you. And so I think it's critical to ensure that it's another piece of that as opposed to the end all be all of what you're looking at to decide or how you interpret that data to make an informed decision and where you're headed. So I think that segues us nicely into our next poll actually, which is really around how is your organization using AI today? So we have a few options for you to choose from there, and hopefully one of those fits the bill, but would be curious as to how some of the organizations out there in the world or that you're representing may be looking at the use of AI.
And as we're waiting for the poll responses to pop up, Sachit gave a wonderful example of screening within the recruiting example earlier. Sourcing. The other thing that didn't come up in that first question is the AI doesn't need to sleep. it can be crawling while humans are resting. It can work 24 hours a day. And so not only can it calculate data faster, but it can keep calculating it. And so if we look at things like recruiting and hiring, the ability to identify passive candidates, which a human can certainly do, but on an ongoing basis for those recs that are hard to find, or in this world where we have 9 million jobs open just in the US at the moment, and there's just not enough people. Where can I find the passive candidates? It's a wonderful example of how some of this stuff can be used. I'll pass back, Jacob.
No, that's a great point, Russell.
It's interesting looking at the poll. I'm very surprised to see retaining current employees does not line up against, but I'm not surprised to see recruiting up there. It's the most common use case right now, I think.
Yeah.
We may have biased the audience with some of the examples we have on the recruiting side, but yeah, it's not surprising. I think that's where the first advancements happen. But you're right. I do think that retaining current employees is something that we hear quite a bit. So it's surprising it's not on the list.
I would see in the future that moving more into also the managing of talent mobility and internal talent, where you're recruiting just to an internal audience versus an external in a sense. So expect that to grow in the coming years as an area of interest as well in the application of AI.
Yeah, I'm also I think performance management is one of those where using AI is not that common, but I do see it on this list. So it's interesting to see it up there.
Definitely. Well, as we keep moving forward, one of the current challenges facing organizations, how is AI able to play a role in helping shape some of the talent challenges that organizations are looking to solve? I'll start with Russell on this one.
Yeah, it's a wonderful question, and if you think about the employee life cycle in a traditional sense, of I hire, I onboard, and then I deploy, and then I train, and then I redeploy, and then I train, and then I redeploy until someone retires, and with associated promotions and all of those things in there, we've actually started to move into a world, because it's more skills driven, because it's less about what is my job and more what am I actually doing. And it doesn't have to be aligned to a true career architecture. I can be doing 2 or 3 jobs at the same time and spending my time in different ways. What the AI can do is it can not only get after what skills do I have, where am I strong, where am I weak, where do I have to complement it, but it can also suggest learning paths. It can suggest employees in a way that isn't necessarily intuitive. And I'll use an IT example because it's easy. But if you have a database administrator, at some point that person was a data modeler before they became a database administrator. So if you have to model data, that person has that skill set. That probably doesn't show up on their resume. It certainly doesn't show up internally if you look at their job description as a database administrator. But I might need that skill set, and that can pop up in an internal search when I'm looking for something for a specific project, or I'm looking for someone in my department, and where do they sit? That ability to get visibility to talent across the organization that almost everyone struggles with, right? I know who I have in front of me. I know who's on my team. I might know who's in my department or my division. But where's the guy that's 2 divisions over that just happens to have some bandwidth right now and fits my need? And the AI can allow me to tap into my talent systems, to tap into what I know about employees, to tap into what employees, if I want, what they put about themselves externally as well. And I'm not talking about creepy things. I'm talking about normal things that are in the public domain, like LinkedIn. But I can get to that information, and the machine can make recommendations for me. And that allows me to move at the speed that the market actually moves. It allows me to adjust my market as I'm running into challenges in a given day, not even in a given quarter, as the business changes, or in a given market. And that ability both makes for more rewarding careers for employees, and it makes for the business's ability to achieve its objectives. And some of this stuff it's not rocket science. It's AI, to be sure, but it's not the leading edge stuff. It's pretty straightforward. If I just have to point at the right data sources and have the right algorithms in there, and I can pull that information out, and the machine can make the recommendations.
Yeah, I think one of the points you hit on there, Russell, about kind of, I think of it as almost uncovering hidden talent, right? You're providing a lot of visibility and further depth and line of sight to skills that individuals possess that may not have been surfaced through everyday conversations or the existing roles that they're in within organizations. And really being able to democratize those skills across the organization, and provide line of sight to leaders and administrators from an HR standpoint of some of the processes and workflows that are required to have that insight, but then also putting the power into the employees' hands to be able to drive their careers in a different direction than perhaps they thought possible, given the skills they possess and what's required in future jobs, and helping them understand what gaps they need to close through, upskilling efforts or experiences.
And Jacob, if I could steal back, there was a question asked of us, and I'm going to read it word for word. It says, "I see a massive challenge with digital mindset when it comes to HR people. It seems that even the basics are overwhelming for them. How did you overcome that mindset?" So I think that plays into this question as well. You have to use the AI and see what the benefit of the AI is to some extent before you fully buy into that it's going to actually help me do my job. That's almost change management 101. I realize that. I have, over the 30 plus years I've been doing this, met very few HR people that don't want to learn. It's a different digital skill set than it might have been when it was a transactional profession, but it's been moving toward data for a long time, 10, 15 years at this point. I think the foundations are there. It's just drawing the correlations, and hopefully we're doing some of this as we talk, to what's the very practical aspect of here's how I would use it in recruiting, here's how I would use it in learning. With that, yes, you can perform a learning programs in place to help people get digital native skills and all of those things, and I would never argue against them. But by just putting it in layman's terms and practical terms, or if you like the term weekend language, it allows you to grab onto conceptually what it is. And once people are grabbed on conceptually, they'll go looking for the learning on their own.
Yeah, I think the application is super powerful. Being able to get people in there and understanding, to your point, using it and really building kind of the momentum behind it through the use is something that I've seen be useful at organizations, as opposed to just talking about it in theory and getting them to those practical application moments where they're able to use it in recruiting or learning. Sachit,
yeah, I'm just going to steal the limelight for a second to talk about more advanced application. I know we were on the more realistic ones, but I'm seeing more and more interest from HR people to actually figure out answers to key business questions that are stopping them from moving ahead. So what I often get asked is there a way for us to figure out who are key influencers in the organization? Now, traditionally, that was done through org network analysis and stuff like that. But is there a more modern, digitally aware, AI-enabled way to actually do it? And there are ways coming up of how, for example, if you take your internal messenger systems and so on, those are more advanced ways of figuring out who's more active in the organization, who's more advanced. Of course, keeping in mind privacy, of course, keeping in mind making sure we're not using the data for the wrong purposes. But those are advanced use cases that are coming up because they actually help organizations unblock certain business issues they're having.
Yeah, just to piggyback on that a bit, right? I do like thinking about the applications, particularly, when you think about the angle of change management here, right? To drive that sort of change, if you focus on the applications that are not possible today using manual processes, it's a way to get the organization to buy in, right? So we use the example right at the beginning around, processing millions of resumes, right? Clearly not something a human being can do. But there's also other applications that we've run into around things like succession planning, which traditionally happened behind closed doors. And it's very hard to actually use data in those processes today. But with AI, you can now actually find the hidden gems within the organization, effectively understand sort of who within the organization that you don't know about today as a human being potentially can do a particular role at the company. Those are the sorts of applications where I've seen companies create the right momentum around adopting new technology.
Especially in a talent market like this.
Great points, all. I think that's a great transition to our next question, which is really around what is talent intelligence? And so, Sachit, I'm going to ask you to kick us off with this one.
Yeah, so the way I think about it, right, we've, in this space, we've evolved from a place where, over the last decade, obviously with the rise of social networks, et cetera, you've seen, in the public domain, people use, user-generated content, et cetera, put it out there in terms of their professional data in social networks like LinkedIn, which I happened to work at for about half a decade in my career, and learned a lot about that space. Over the course of the last decade, I think what we've transitioned into is a world where today the data is extremely fragmented, right? You have data that sits in internal systems like HRISs, applicant tracking systems, and name the flavor of the system that exists, right, within large enterprises. Trying to make sense of all of that data historically has been a very hard thing for an organization. And what talent intelligence is basically a layer that puts all of that data together, harmonizes it, and organizes it in a way where the types of decisions that historically were very difficult to make can be made, right? Whether it is hiring the right candidate for an open position, or understanding the value of the skills that are in your existing employee base. These are the sorts of things that talent intelligence enables. And the applications of this are infinite, right? Whether it comes to internal mobility, understanding the what other things that people can do today, in addition to also examples like succession planning, et cetera, within the organization. These are the sorts of things that talent intelligence enables within the organization. And obviously within the last couple of years, as we've seen all of the ups and downs in the economy, the sort of shifts that have happened due to COVID. One specific example that I can give from my own career, right? So I happened to be at a frontline company during the pandemic. It was Uber. And obviously it had a pretty dramatic change in its business model, as a result of COVID. And the company was faced with this very interesting decision, right? Which around February of 2020, which is what does it do given that 90% of its core business had fallen within the span of a week as the world shut down. And it had to make a number of talent decisions during that, very short span of time. And a lot of mistakes were made because it didn't tend to, it didn't at the time have talent intelligence data to make some of these decisions with. And so you ended up in this situation where mass layoffs happened while, another one of its core businesses, which was the Uber Eats business, started to grow like wildfire. And those are the sorts of things that, talent intelligence can enable within, in a practical basis within an organization, right? Which is, how do you redeploy your talent to the right place? And, long story short on the Uber front is that thousands of people were laid off, but then many of them had to be called back a month later because, it didn't have the people to operate Uber Eats. And that's the sort of change that happens in many organizations where talent intelligence data is valuable to making those sorts of decisions.
Sachit, would it be fair to say that talent intelligence is the way you actually make sense of all the data, whether you use AI or not, and give it in a form such that HR and business users can actually take action on it?
Yeah, that's a simple way to think about it, right? I mean, similar to like Google's mission to organize the world's data, this is about organizing people data in a way where HR professionals can make the types of talent decisions that they need to for any sort of application, right? Which historically has been very, very difficult to make.
Yeah.
I'm not going to pile on. That was good.
I think that actually connects into the next question pretty closely. Of what are some organizations or companies that you've observed starting to head down this path in the use of talent intelligence? How are they going about it? I think you mentioned a couple examples there, Sachit, of like real time, but like for those that are looking to kind of get started, where are some of the initial footholds? And Ashwin, I was going to kick off with you on this one, but for everybody else, please feel free to jump in.
Yeah, I'll tell you how I think about it, right? I think identifying a goal and a business use case and determining the value of that, I think, is critical as a first step. So instead of starting all over the place, it might be useful to say, where are you spending the most money, or what's the most value you can bring? It can be as simple as a very specific HR goal, candidate screening, you have thousands of resumes, or it could be a business goal you want to impact, right? I have high demand in a specific organization, and I need to know which other people from different parts of the organization I can reskill to actually bring them in here to actually fill that demand, right? So determining what your goals are and determining what the value you're going to generate out of it is key before you start down this. Once you do that, I would suggest doing something like a proof of concept to actually prove that it's actually valuable and it works, right? Once you have done that, then it comes to institutionalizing it at scale and enabling it large scale and making it into a continuous ongoing process. But if you have done the first three steps right, identifying goals, determining value, and proving that it works through a POC, the last two ought to be much easier to do. So that's where I would start. Pick one use case which you think is useful. I think we saw it from the polls. The recruiting one is probably the most obvious one right now. But I've seen skills as the other one that ends up coming more and more often right now. How do you make sense of the skills people have? How do you make sense of skills needed for roles? That's probably the second one that I would probably think of. Sachit,
Yeah.
Russell?
I would spin it slightly, and I would say follow the pain. And the pain can be in recruiting, but usually when there's pain in recruiting, there's pain somewhere behind it, whether it's retention, whether it's forecasting, whether it's capacity planning, whether it's workforce planning. And so follow the pain and start there, because then you get, from a stakeholder analysis point of view, if I can fix your problem to the business, then I get the buy-in to go and do all the other things that this stuff is capable of. I don't have to boil the ocean and do it all at once. I need to knock off real world business problems. We live in a world where for at least 20 years, finance has been able to put dashboards in front of people that say things like, this is your burn rate today, and this is what we allocated in the budget, and therefore you can't do what you want to do. Talent intelligence allows us to take that and add to it and say, this is what the talent is capable of doing. Either change your business strategy or change your talent. And I don't mean fire them as I say that. I mean, upskill them, all those other things, right? But you can do one or the other, but this is what your talent is capable of today. If I look at where we see practical examples going on, we're seeing practical examples in retail as they're trying to figure out how to optimize shifts, whether it's in the stores or the delivery centers. We're seeing practical examples in high tech and financial services as professions change. And one of those, I'm going to use the word IT, but I really mean the frontline pieces of IT, actuarial, underwriting, wealth management, right? Those type of things. How are those jobs changing, and how can I use these things to take my people on that journey with me? Because it's my customers that are taking me on that journey. It's the market that's taking me on that journey, and my talent has to keep up. How can I use AI to, just because we started with recruiting, if I have to hire 1,000 people on the first day of the fiscal year, I have a problem. If my turnover is 16% and I bring it down to 8, and I only have to hire 500, I still have a problem, but it's a much smaller problem. Right. And so how can I use it to get to that root cause analysis and get to what's the underlying problems and then go after them? And I think some of the deep learning algorithms and some of the things like talent marketplaces, which will show you which jobs people are interested in, which ones they're not at the end of the day. Yes, it will enable career pathing and all those things, and that's all great. But from a business point of view, it'll also tell me I'm going to have a whole lot of trouble filling this job, so I got to pay some more attention to it. Right. And some of those applications are very practical, and they make for wonderful, I'm going to use the word pilot, but don't constrict pilot by size, constrict pilot by complexity. Pick off chunks that you can eat and solve in a reasonable period of time, a quarter, a half, something that'll move the needle for the business, because this is one of those things. Once the snowball starts rolling, it's not slowing down, but it takes a little push to get it rolling.
I think you actually started to address some of the next question that we had teed up, which was really around what are some of the ways you have seen HR and talent leaders get stakeholder buy-in around AI-driven transformation, and how do they really build that excitement? And so I think, to your point, Russell, around kind of that snowball, how do you kind of get that rolling and creating the momentum behind the value case associated with the use of AI? And I'm gonna ask that Sachit take the first swing at this one, and then we'll pass it around.
I really liked Russell's comment around following the pain, right? And, just to maybe dive into some of the pain points that I've been hearing about, as I talk to, CEOs and CHROs in many large corporations, some of the things that I'm hearing really are around this idea of future-proofing the organization, right? And really focusing on, is the organization going to be competitive, 1-2 years looking out down the future. And obviously, this has been something that is top of mind for a lot of corporations at the moment, right? With all of the shifts that we've seen, with the shifts in the economy, the shifts in sort of if you look at all of the changes that have happened due to the pandemic, to business cycles, all of these things have been coming and hitting organizations in ways that, obviously haven't happened before. And adjusting to all of this has just been a huge challenge, right? So this whole idea of this focus on skills and, really understanding the organization in a data-driven fashion is something that I keep hearing quite a bit. And this is an area where I do think that, the combination of data and really understanding the skills of the employees that are already part of the organization is really been a focus. And that is, an area of, in my opinion, a huge amount of investment right now in this industry, right? As we try to figure out the patterns of, who are the people, what are their skills, what are they capable of doing next, and then effectively use the technology to start to map out what the ideal organization looks like as it goes out in the future. So that's something that I have been seeing quite a bit in some of these conversations, but I'm curious if some of, if Russell and Ashwin, if you're hearing the same in your conversations.
Most definitely. We like to blame COVID for a lot of things, and there's a lot of things to blame it for, but a lot of these things were happening already. All it did was accelerate them. The demographic challenges that are now impacting workforce availability and workforce challenges, the shift because of digitization and the pace of change of how fast jobs are changing, all of that was underway before COVID. It didn't slow down. The demographics didn't change. And so we are seeing a lot of, but this is what we have to do today, and this is what we have to do tomorrow, and we want to know when it's coming, and we want to know what jobs are changing when, and so we have seen a massive increase in things like workforce planning because people want to know not just what, but when. When is the hard question, right? How do I forecast what I'm going to need tomorrow? How do I model if I need to do it with a bot or I need to do it with a person? If it's a person, if it's a direct employee or an indirect employee, and where should I do it? And all of those things. And so talent intelligence, applied intelligence, put against talent challenges allows me to get after that and allows me to reduce my risk that I'm not going to be able to meet whatever the need of the business is. To your Uber example, that's certainly a good one, right? We have seen any number of businesses muddle through supply chain challenges. I can't make materials instantly appear, but the same way I would tackle supply chain by saying, are there other routes? Is there another plant? Can I do this thing in Japan instead of China, or India instead of China? And what would that look like? And just the ability to model it. But that talent challenge, I'm giving big global examples, but that talent challenge exists on an assembly line in an auto parts manufacturer in Ohio. It exists in a Dunkin' Donuts store. It exists in a Best Buy. It exists in a Walmart. I mean, those problems are everywhere. They don't have to be writ large. By putting a capability in that enables me to get that visibility and to come at them in a more quantitative way instead of a more gut feel qualitative way. This is how we've always done it, so we're going to do it this way. I get more efficient, and careers get more rewarding, and employees get more engaged. And when those things happen, productivity ticks up, innovation ticks up, right? And so I think we have seen those examples writ large. We're certainly getting asked those questions on a daily basis. There is not one right answer. Picking on two wonderful clients, but Coke and Pepsi are completely different customers with completely different cultures. Right, that they look at the world entirely different, even though the products are similar, right? Or Procter and Gamble and Colgate, if you prefer, but Home Depot and Lowe's, they're just different, even though they do the same thing. And so, what are you trying to do? And the amount of things we know about our employees, by the way, is staggering. We just don't have an easy way to get to it.
Russell, there's a question in the chat which is probably best for you on strategic workforce planning.
Let me see if I can find it real quick. Where AI is being used in strategic workforce planning, and I'm going to way oversimplify this, but it's used in three places. It is used to assess skills. So in my supply side of the equation, what is my workforce capable of today, especially if I want to get visibility to some of the capabilities in my indirect workforce, because I don't have as much information about them and I can't get as much information about them directly. It is used in the actual modeling that you use to write the fulfillment models to write the workforce plans. And then the hardest part of strategic workforce planning has always been and remains, how is work done? What does good look like? What is the difference between a project or a volume? And using HR as an easy example, if I have 200 employees, I need one HR person. If I have 500 employees, I need 2.4, right? That's volume based. What do the benchmarks look like for that? And how do I incorporate that into my ongoing modeling? And so as I look at AI, it allows me to get after the same way it can look at employees without actually asking them what their skills are and saying, what are your skills? Let's catalog them. I can look at my business and I can use the AI to say, what am I trying to do? And how do I forecast that as units of labor? And I've way oversimplified it, but all three of those areas, at the end of the day, it's third semester calculus.
I'm gonna pile on, Russ, and I'm gonna take this one step forward, right? As you go beyond workforce planning, what I've seen organizations ask more and more about is something you may have heard the term digital twin quite often, but it's basically being able to model your organizational talent, and be able to see what happens if you make specific changes to the organization ahead of time. So it's the ultimate form of predictive analytics. If you're able to say what happens if I, as an example, mandate everyone has to come to work 3 days a week versus working from home 5 days a week. Those are the kind of questions people want answers to. I don't think we are there yet, but more and more people are beginning to work on stuff like this where you can actually model the entire organization at one go. That's another form of workforce plan.
Yeah, that's absolutely where the leading edge is. And it's not that far off. It's within the next year in a lot of places.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we have one remaining poll to take, but before we move, well, we're moving there, but also would love to hear from all of you. If you have any questions, feel free to submit them. We can address them after this poll, and are also happy to follow up on any questions that may have not gotten addressed thus far. But this last poll here is really focused on given the movement towards talent intelligence, use of AI, and various HR and talent practices. Where's your organization? Where does it fall within your organization's strategic priorities? Do you see it already happening? Are you already starting to move towards a skills-based hiring model? Are you looking at it on a short-term horizon in the next 3 months, having some of these discussions of how it might integrate into some of your various talent workflows? Is it something that looks like it's on the little bit longer term horizon, or is it potentially a year off, depending on where you are? So let's see some responses come in.
I can see a bias towards future.
I'd be curious because there are things here that can cost a lot of money, but most of these things do not cost a lot of money. You can gobble them in bite-sized chunks, and I'd be curious if that's about knowledge in the business of what it can do, if it's cultural resistance, or if it's more just economic headwinds at the moment and inclinations against capital spending because of the uncertainty in the marketplace. And I don't know what the answer is, but I saw that as well. I am heartened by 33% of organizations are at least doing something. Joel, you asked a question about bias in artificial intelligence, and it's more to Ashwin and Sachi than to me, but it's a very real concern. It's something people have to pay attention to. I mean, theoretically, AI should take the bias out. A computer doesn't care if you're black, white, green, purple, polka dots, whatever gender. It doesn't care. It only cares, can you do X with Y? And so the bias should go away. But the reality is there have been enough experiments that as these things learn, because the word intelligence, artificial intelligence, you train the models and they learn. As they learn, they can develop the same biases that human beings have. And if they do it, because they're looking at massive data sets as opposed to ones and twos, as we talked about earlier, the impact of that can be far greater. And so one of the things that the data scientists do and the data groups that both on the vendor side and within companies have to pay attention to is it doing something that doesn't feel right? And if it is, let's ask some questions, and you have to test it. You absolutely have to test it. We've gotten better at it. There's a wonderful experiment that Microsoft ran, I don't know, 5 years ago, and they created a Twitter bot out of AI, and it became about as anti-Semitic and racist as you can become in like hours. And they had to take it down. We learned from that as a society, as a profession. We learned from that. That doesn't happen as often anymore. But is it possible? Sure. I'll leave to my colleagues on the technical things, but it's just something you have to watch for. It's not a reason not to do it. It's a reason to set up a good governance model.
Yeah, I think where I come out on this is that if you build the right controls in the algorithms that we're building, across this industry, you could actually do much better than what is the norm for a human being in this industry, right? Because the fact is that bias exists in every aspect of human society, right? And it's a question of training the right algorithms that understand where that bias comes from, understand what is the implications of it, and then effectively designing controls that prevent that bias from effectively being the norm, right? And that is effectively where I think we're sort of in the infancy in this industry and figuring all of that out. But with the right controls, I'm an optimist that can be designed out of the algorithms that are implemented in this space.
I agree. I don't really have much more to add over and about what Russell and Sachit said.
All right.
Maybe one other point I would like to bring up, which is often alongside bias. I think I like to think of explainability as well alongside bias, right? It's not just the fact that it has to be de-biased, but some of these things also you have to be able to explain it. Right? It should not just be a black box all the time. I don't know, Sachit, Russell, if you have thoughts on that.
I would say garbage in, garbage out. If we want to keep it to the simplest, I don't necessarily need to know what the algorithm is doing. I don't have to understand the math, but I have to understand these data points should get me those kind of answers so that I can validate that the math is doing what it's supposed to. That's a practitioner's view. As a former practitioner, before I came back to consulting, that's a reasonable thing. That's a data fluency you can expect a practitioner or a business person on the line, if it's not an HR person, to have. It's to the mathematicians and the data scientists to then go and figure out the whys and the whats and to recode if there's something there that isn't. But I'm putting data in with an expected outcome. I may not get exactly the outcome I get, but if I'm trying to manufacture cars and I'm getting apple pies, I should notice it, right?
Yeah, from my perspective, I think it really comes down to trust, right, in algorithms. And if the more explainable they are, the more you can trust them, right? And so, for example, like showing the reasons why someone may be a high match score in a particular situation and helping the human being on the other side making the ultimate decision on whether to advance them or not to advance them, give them an understanding of how the algorithm came up with that inference is important, right? So it depends on the application, but it really, for me, it is really about establishing trust with the users.
I like the way you put that.
I would like to, just because so many said in the future, this is coming 12 plus months out. They see their organizations going there, but they haven't really figured out maybe what it is or what it's going to look like. One of the things we learned in the early stages of this, and by the early stages, I mean things like robotic process automation and those type of technologies, is businesses are risk adverse. And so people would put their toe in the water and they'd say, let's build 2 bots and see if that moves the needle. Let's build 4 bots and see if that moves the needle. I would echo what Ashwin said earlier and say, pick a pilot spot, pick a pain point. It's not to spend money for the sake of spending money, but you're not going to get much off of 1 or 2. You need something that can actually move the needle, and you need to aim big enough for what you're trying to do to get to that. That doesn't have to cost you millions of dollars. Please don't hear that in what I just said. It just has to be, we're going to trust the AI for 3 months. Maybe we run both processes at the same time and see what the answer is among one versus the other. But I'm really going to trust it, and I'm going to let it give me an answer as well. And I'm going to just dive off the bridge for a short period of time with controls. It doesn't mean I'm making business decisions off of what it spits out. But let it do its thing. Don't try and just put your toe in the water, because it will not get you the results in any kind of meaningful way that you can build a business case off of.
And I'm gonna connect a couple dots there. I think when to what you were just talking about, Russell and Ashwin, your point around explainability earlier, and then I'm going to connect it back to the comment earlier around the kind of digitization of the HR function and moving more to becoming digitally fluent. I think that there's a compelling case around becoming better storytellers as it relates to data and being able to better explain it and show and demonstrate the value to business leaders and other HR leaders within the organization. And I think that's an area where we see a lot of emphasis and doubling down on kind of that ability to just be better storytellers and use that as a vehicle to be able to explain some of the components of this and be able to tie it and connect the threads across not only the purposes of what HR serves as from a function and the services that they provide to their customers or the employees, but really being able to drive that business value and solve some of those pain points that we've hit on.
I think there's a question in the chat as well. Who do you think gets it right? Which company is the closest?
Yeah, I was looking at that. Done right, this provides competitive advantage, to be sure. I don't think there's one company that you can say this is the gold standard. I think you'd be, or maybe you wouldn't, but 2/3 of a career in consulting, and I can tell you there are very successful companies that are very backwards at times. And that, well, you might think a company like a Google or a Microsoft or an Amazon, because they're digital native companies, would be exceptional at this. Some of the ones that are really good at it, because it's a journey and have put the pieces in place over 3, 4, 5 years as they've gone on that journey, are old line manufacturers and resource companies and utilities that are, using data in different ways because they face bigger challenges. At the end of the day, Google doesn't have a whole lot of trouble attracting employees. It's more who they're going to hire. The same could not be said for Dominion Energy or Synergy or Southern California Edison. And so with different challenges comes a different desperation. And what you find is that some of these companies that you would never think they would be that leading edge, but because they have to be, because it's the only way they can compete, those are the ones that have jumped off the bridge further. And they've all started in different places. Some of them started with talent marketplace. Some of them started with recruiting. Some of them have started with leadership development and succession planning. But they've all started with this is not working and we have to do it differently. And everything we've tried hasn't. So let's try something outside the box. And it's there's a component to leadership skill set somewhere in leadership competencies that looks like something like calculated risk. It's when a true leader stands up and says, yeah, we're going to jump off this bridge and maybe we'll get it wrong. And if we do, we're going to stop, but it's not working the way it is. So let's go. And I think without, because of client confidentiality, saying this company is X and that company is Y, which I can't do, I would say it's across the board and it's in certain industries. But what we have started to see is the ones that have lower turnover and better luck recruiting, or whether you think of it that way or not, they're doing some of this stuff in the background. If you traced it back, you would find it.
I'm just going to add one specific industry. And if you think of companies that have a business need to do this, those companies are more likely to actually end up doing it. My favorite example to give people is when you think about workforce planning, think about all of the airline companies who have to schedule this on a day-to-day basis. The smallest miss makes them lose millions of dollars. So those companies have incentive to get it right. As an example, workforce planning has to be, what are improved ways of doing workforce planning, whether you use AI, whether you use automated systems. The companies that have incentives from a business perspective are probably more likely to get it right.
All right. Well, thank you, Ashwin, Sachit, Russell. Appreciate y'all's time today and to ACI for hosting this session. At this point, I'm going to turn it back over to Joelle to close us out for the day.
Thank you, Jacob, and thank you all for such an enlightening presentation on a truly exciting topic. Thank you so much. We're happy to have experts in the room to talk about this. So we've taken quite a few questions from our listeners, so we'll close out now. I think that's the extent of the questions that we have, but please, if you still have questions for our presenters, please type them into the chat immediately as we're beginning to close. Just a reminder to HCI members, today's webcast has been approved for HRCI and SHRM credit, as well as for HCI recertification. Your credits for attending this webcast will soon show up in your My HCI profile under the transcript tab. We'd really love to hear about your experience as an HCI member. So for your feedback, you will receive $200 off any upcoming HCI certification program through the end of 2023. So we ask that you please take our HCI member survey and tell us how we can improve and continue to be your go-to source for strategic HR training and resources. So if you'll click on the link in chat, you can take that survey and again, receive $200 off any upcoming HCI certification program. And while you're there on our website, don't forget to check out hci.org for even more insights, as well as information on our certifications, virtual conferences, premium membership, and more. Before we say thank you to our presenters, we've got one more question that has come in. How close should HR get to infrastructure and security when they start thinking about AI? Should HR people also start thinking like architects? Great question.
So I'll take the first shot at that one. I think not. I think of HR people more as the business consumers of what. I don't think you need to start thinking. You need to be more aware of AI pros and cons, what it can do, what are the risks you face, all of those things. But I don't think there's a need to actually become an AI architect or an infrastructure security architect or stuff like that. I think just being aware of the pros and cons is probably a really good first step. There's another
We've
one
got it.
in there
Yeah,
which
there's
says, are there enterprises that sell data to third parties and monetize them?
in a compliant way, he emphasized.
Yeah.
Yes, that's the short answer. Yes.
Yes.
There are. There's a number of them, and it would be inappropriate to make a single recommendation, but there are a number of data aggregators that pull this stuff together that can be pulled into the models, and they're fairly easy to locate.
Hey, great. Any other responses to either of those questions, gentlemen? All good? Okay, I would like to say one more thank you to you all, our presenters for today, and of course, all of the good people at Eightfold AI. Thank you once again for sponsoring this. I'd also like to thank our webcast viewers, everyone out there. Thanks for the great questions. Thanks for spending an hour with us, and we will see you next time.